Imagine being just 13 years old and already expected to run a farm, fight in battle, or even marry and start a family. For a medieval teenager, there was no long pause between childhood and adulthood. Life moved fast, and every choice shaped their future. Today, we'll step inside their world. From apprentices scrubbing in workshops, to noble squires dreaming of knighthood, to village girls preparing for marriage. Stay with me until the end, and you'll discover what life was really like when being a teenager wasn't about freedom. It was about survival, duty, and growing up far too soon. Chapter 1. The first step into work. Imagine you are a teenager in a small medieval village, perhaps somewhere in England in the 13th century, or a modest town in northern France. The idea of teenager, as we know it today, simply does not exist. Childhood ends quickly, and the transition to adulthood begins as soon as a child can. Walk steadily, speak clearly, and show a pair of capable hands. By the age of 12 or 13, you are already expected to work, to contribute, and to shoulder responsibilities that many in the modern world would find unthinkable for someone so young. Your life has been shaped since birth by the rhythms of work. From the moment you could lift a small bucket of water or scatter grain for chickens, you have been part of the household economy. But around this age, you cross a threshold, the first step into the world of real labor. This is the defining feature of adolescence in medieval Europe. You do not have the luxury of teen years as an in-between stage. You are simply a small adult, now expected to learn a trade, take on service, or commit to work that would shape your entire future. Work in the fields. For the majority of teenagers, those born to peasant families, life meant work in the fields. Peasants formed nearly 90% of the medieval population, and their teenagers followed predictable patterns. At dawn, while mist still clings to the damp earth, you might be set out to herd sheep or cattle. This was often the first responsibility given to young adolescents. The work was simple but essential, keeping animals safe, guiding them to pasture, and ensuring none wandered into forbidden lands. Shepherding was lonely, and many teenagers spent hours with only their dog for company, sometimes learning to carve small wooden toys or play pipes to pass the time. As you grew stronger, the tasks became harder. Harvest season demanded back-breaking labor. Teenagers wielded sickles to cut grain, bundled sheaves of wheat, and stacked hay under the relentless summer sun. Even winter had no rest, for wood had to be gathered, fences repaired, and animals tended. For medieval peasants, the phrase resting teenager was nearly a contradiction. Apprenticeships in towns, yet not every teenager remained tied to the soil. For those whose parents sought opportunity beyond the village, apprenticeships offered another path. Boys as young as 12 were bound by contract to a master craftsman in a town or city. This meant leaving home, sometimes traveling many miles, and living under strict discipline for 7 years or more. Apprenticeships covered trades such as blacksmithing, carpentry, tailoring, or shoemaking. As an apprentice, you lived in your master's household, ate at his table, and followed his rules as strictly as a son. But unlike a son, you were there to work without pay. Your wages were your training. Day after day, you fetched water, stoked fires, swept workshops, and ran errands. Slowly, you were permitted to touch the tools, to hammer iron, to cut cloth, or to stir vats of dye. For many, this apprenticeship was both a burden and a hope. It was burdensome because discipline could be harsh. Masters were known to strike apprentices for laziness or mistakes. Yet it also offered the chance to one day earn the title of journeyman, and eventually, master. In a rigid society where birth determined most of your life's course, an apprenticeship gave you at least some measure of mobility. The life of a page for teenagers of noble families, work looked very different. Sons of knights or minor nobles were often sent to serve in the household of a greater lord. At around age 7, they began as pages, but by the time they reached their teenage years, their duties grew heavier. A teenage page was expected to assist at table, to deliver messages, and to learn horsemanship, hunting, and the etiquette of the court. The daily routine was structured and strict. You rose early to attend prayers with the household, helped prepare your master's armor or weapons for the day, and spent hours practicing with wooden swords or riding under the instruction of seasoned knights. You also learned manners, poetry, and perhaps some Latin, for even in noble households, education was valued as a mark of refinement. Yet this too was labor, though not of the plow or forge. Service demanded obedience, physical exertion, and the ability to withstand the casual humiliations of senior knights or lords. Pages were often mocked, ordered about, and expected to endure without complaint, for this was part of the training. That would, in time, prepare them to become squires, and eventually knights themselves. Girls at work, teenage girls faced their own demanding paths. In peasant households, girls worked alongside their mothers from dawn to dusk. They ground grain by hand with heavy querns, spun wool into thread, and learned the art of cooking stews that could stretch meager ingredients to feed an entire family. They were responsible for tending gardens, milking cows, and gathering herbs for girls of towns. Apprenticeships existed as well, though less formally. Some trained in weaving, brewing, or embroidery. Many worked in domestic service, as maids, cooks, or wet nurses in wealthier households. For noble girls, adolescence was a period of intense preparation for marriage. They learned needlework, household management, and the skills necessary to run an estate, for one day they might find themselves lady of a manor, responsible for dozens of servants and tenants. The burden of responsibility, what all medieval teenagers shared, regardless of class, was the abrupt weight of responsibility. Unlike the modern notion of adolescence as a time of exploration and self-discovery, the medieval world demanded productivity and discipline. Mistakes were not lightly tolerated, for they could mean hunger, loss, or dishonor to a household. By your teenage years, you were already an economic unit, a worker contributing to the survival of the family. Whether you herded sheep, scrubbed floors in a master's house, or carried trays in a noble hall, your labor was indispensable. And yet, despite the laborious routines, these teenage years were also a kind of preparation, a liminal stage between dependence and the full weight of adult responsibility. For some, it was a chance to learn skills that could eventually bring prosperity. For others, it was simply the beginning of a lifetime of toil. But what was it like, day after day, to actually live this life? How did medieval teenagers find meaning, energy, and even joy in their monotonous duties? Could they carve out moments of leisure amid the constant demand for work? Chapter 2. Work, Play, and the Rare Moments of Freedom. When we picture the life of a medieval teenager, it is tempting to imagine nothing but labor, endless hours of digging in the soil, scrubbing pots, or serving meals in drafty gray halls. And while that was often the reality, it would be misleading to say that these teenagers never experienced play, or that they did not carve out small fragments of freedom within their heavily regulated days. Human beings, even in the most demanding societies, find ways to laugh, to bond, and to rest, and medieval adolescents were no exception. The rhythms of the calendar. The most important breaks in work came not from personal choice, but from the rhythm of the medieval calendar itself. Unlike modern life, with its rigid separation of weekend and work week, the medieval world was guided by holy days, saints' feast days, and the liturgical year. In practice, this meant that even the busiest teenager could expect a scattering of pauses across the year. A peasant boy who worked in the fields might toil 14 hours a day during harvest time. Yet when Easter arrived, or when the feast of the village's patron saint came around, work slowed. The church bells rang, candles were lit, and families gathered for communal meals. For a teenage apprentice in a bustling town, feast days meant something similar. The workshop shut its doors, The master's household relaxed its rules, and apprentices could slip into the streets to join the crowd at the market square. These moments were precious. They did not erase the drudgery of daily work, but they punctuated it, offering medieval teenagers a rhythm of anticipation, something to look forward to. For young people, feast days often meant games, songs, and dances. In villages, teenagers gathered in the fields to play ball games, wrestle, or test each other in feats of agility. In towns, apprentices staged mock battles with wooden sticks, while girls might form circles for songs and clapping games. These amusements were not idle distractions. They were part of the social fabric, helping teenagers bond with one another and find their place in the community. Games and pastimes. The games medieval teenagers played were often simple, but they reveal much about the values of their society. In villages, mob football was a chaotic favorite, an early form of soccer, played with no set field and virtually no rules, where one group tried to drag a ball or inflated pig's bladder toward a designated goal. Entire villages sometimes joined in, but teenagers were the most active participants, running wildly through streets, fields, and even rivers. The game could be brutal. Sprained ankles and bruises were common, but it was exhilarating, a burst of unstructured freedom. In otherwise structured lives, other games required less physical exertion. Dice and board games circulated widely, even among the poor. Teenagers carved their own dice from bone or wood and played simple gambling games in corners of taverns or under trees in the fields. More structured games like Nine Men's Morris, a kind of strategy board game, were popular as well, often scratched into the surfaces of church porches or the backs of benches. Girls had their amusements too, though they were often tied to domestic crafts. Weaving circles, where groups of young women worked together at spinning or embroidery while singing, were both productive and social. They shared jokes, told stories, and sometimes whispered secrets about courtships or marriage prospects. Even when the activity was practical, the social element turned it into a form of leisure. Apprentices and the struggle for freedom. For apprentices, leisure was far more restricted. Bound by contracts and the authority of their masters, they were rarely free to come and go as they pleased. Still, apprentices carved out their own culture of youthful rebellion. Medieval records complain frequently of rowdy apprentices, filling city streets after dark, brawling, playing loud games, or sneaking into taverns. The strict discipline of workshop life almost guaranteed this rebellious energy. After long hours of sweeping, fetching, and obeying orders, teenage apprentices sought release. Some formed informal brotherhoods or fraternities, small social groups that gave them a sense of identity outside of their master's control. These groups were sometimes tolerated, sometimes condemned, but they provided young men with a sense of belonging. Even here, play was not entirely separate from training. Apprentices often used leisure time to practice their crafts informally. A carpenter's apprentice might carve a small toy boat, or a tailor's apprentice might stitch a decorative patch into his own tunic. These personal projects blurred the line between work and play, giving the teenager a sense of ownership over skills that otherwise belonged entirely to the master. Music, storytelling, and performance. Beyond games, music and storytelling were central to the leisure of medieval teenagers. In villages, evenings were often filled with communal singing. A boy tending sheep by day might bring a simple wooden flute to the fields, practicing melodies as a way to pass the hours. In the evenings, groups of young people sang ballads, often humorous or romantic, sometimes with verses improvised on the spot. Storytelling was equally vital. Since books were scarce and literacy limited, oral tales circulated widely. Teenagers learned stories of saints, folk tales of trickster animals, and even tales of knights and battles told by wandering minstrels. For many, these stories were the closest thing to an imaginative escape, transporting them beyond the narrow confines of village or workshop life. festivals offered another chance for performance. Mystery plays, dramatizations of biblical stories performed in towns, often involved young participants, either as actors or assistants. Teenagers might carry props, wear costumes, or help construct the wooden stages. These plays were communal events, combining devotion, entertainment, and an opportunity for young people to showcase themselves in front of neighbors. The role of romance in courtship. It would be incomplete to speak of medieval teenage life without mentioning romance. Courtship was not simply a private matter. It was woven into the social life of adolescence. Dancing was a major outlet for this. During village festivals or noble gatherings, teenagers joined in circle dances or line dances, often accompanied by fiddles or drums. These dances were moments of social interaction, where glances were exchanged, jokes whispered, and sometimes lifelong matches began. For peasant teenagers, courtship was often informal. A boy might walk a girl home after a dance, or they might meet at the communal well. For noble teenagers, however, everything was more regulated. Pages and young noble women were expected to observe courtly behavior, speaking with measured politeness, offering tokens, and learning the elaborate rituals of courtly love. While many of these rituals were symbolic, they shaped the way young nobles thought about relationships, weaving together duty, reputation, and emotion. The shadow of restriction, yet leisure was never entirely free. The medieval world was strict about boundaries, and teenagers were often reminded of their place. A peasant boy could play football, but only when work was finished. An apprentice might sneak into a tavern, but if caught, his master could beat him or even extend his term of service. A noble page might sing or dance, but always under the watchful eyes of lords and ladies, with strict rules about conduct. Girls faced even tighter restrictions. In many places, they were expected to remain close to home, their leisure bound up in domestic work or small gatherings of neighbors. Their reputations were closely guarded, and excessive freedom was frowned upon. Even courtship carried risks. Rumors of impropriety could damage not only the girl, but her entire family's honor. Still, within these boundaries, medieval teenagers found ways to live with laughter, camaraderie, and even joy. Their games, songs, and festivals offered a necessary counterweight to labor. Work may have defined them, but it did not wholly consume them, and yet, we must wonder, how did these fleeting moments of freedom prepare teenagers for the future roles they were expected to take on? Was this play simply an escape, or was it part of a larger training, shaping them into the adults they would soon become? Chapter 3. From youth to adulthood, marriage, duty, and the end of childhood, medieval life had little patience for prolonged adolescence. What we think of today as teenage years, a stage of self-discovery, experimentation, and partial independence, did not exist in the same way during the Middle Ages. For the most part, young people moved swiftly from the halfway world of apprenticeship, service, or youthful chores into the heavy mantle of adult responsibility. The path into adulthood was neither uniform nor leisurely. It depended greatly on class, gender, and geography. Yet across villages and cities, castles and cottages, the transition from youth to adult life followed a rhythm that was both predictable and unforgiving. The moment of legal adulthood in medieval law, adulthood was often defined not by birthdays, but by capability. Boys were generally considered to reach majority between the ages of 12 and 14 for certain purposes, such as making oaths or working as apprentices, but full adult rights came later, often around 21. Girls, meanwhile, were often treated as marriageable by the time they were 12 or 14. Though this did not mean every girl married that young, the symbolic markers of adulthood varied. For peasants, taking on a strip of land in the village fields could signal that a teenager was now an adult in the eyes of neighbors. For apprentices, it was the moment of becoming a journeyman, receiving a certificate or proof of training that allowed them to seek wages independently. For noble youths, Adulthood often coincided with the ceremonial dubbing of a knight, or, for noble women, the formal arrangements of marriage. Marriage is a threshold. For many medieval teenagers, marriage was the most definitive marker of adulthood. It was not simply a private affair, but a public declaration of belonging to the adult community. In villages, marriages were usually arranged with an eye to land, labor, and alliance. A peasant's son might be matched with a girl from a neighboring household in order to combine fields or ensure that both families had enough hands for farm work. Girls often entered marriage younger than boys. It was not uncommon for a bride to be 14 or 15, though many were older. A groom, by contrast, might wait until he was in his late teens or early 20s, after he had accumulated some measure of resources or had finished an apprenticeship. Marriage was rarely about romance in the modern sense, but young people were not entirely without choice. There are records of couples eloping, resisting parental matches, or appealing to church courts to defend unions based on mutual consent. Among the nobility, marriage was even more strategic. Teenagers of noble birth could find themselves bound to alliances arranged when they were still children. A noble girl might be betrothed at 10 or 12, then sent to live in her future husband's household until she came of age. A noble boy, perhaps, serving as a page, could suddenly find himself bound by vows that shaped not only his personal life, but also the politics of entire regions. For all classes, marriage meant the end of youth. A married teenager was now responsible for managing a household, contributing to the village economy, or upholding a noble family's prestige. Apprenticeship completed, journeyman begun. For boys in towns, the transition to adulthood often came not through marriage first, but through the completion of apprenticeship. After 7 or more years of training, a boy of 18 or 19 might at last be freed from the authority of his master. He became a journeyman, literally one who worked by the day, offering his labor for wages. This stage was both liberating and precarious. Journeymen had more freedom than apprentices, but they were not yet masters. They had to travel from town to town, seeking work, saving wages, and in many guilds, proving their skill by creating a masterpiece. Until they achieved master status, journeymen remained in a liminal place, freer than apprentices but not yet secure. For some, the stage stretched into their 20s or 30s. But in the eyes of society, even journeymen were adults, could marry, own some property, and make contracts. The strict obedience of adolescence had given way to responsibility. Noble youths and the dubbing of knights. Among the nobility, boys who had served as pages or squires transitioned into manhood through the ritual of knighthood. The dubbing ceremony was both practical and symbolic. After years of tending horses, carrying armor, and learning courtly manners, a squire of 18 or 21 might kneel before his lord, receive a sword, and rise as a knight. This moment marked him as a warrior and a man of responsibility. Knights swore oaths of loyalty, promising to defend their lords, their lands, and the church. With this, the carefree energy of youth was officially behind them. For noble women, the transition was less ceremonial, but no less binding. Adulthood arrived in the form of betrothal, marriage, and the running of a household. A teenage noblewoman might suddenly find herself overseeing servants, managing estates, or even acting as regent if her husband was absent at war. Work as an adult burden. For peasants, adulthood meant full immersion in the agricultural cycle. A teenage boy who had once helped his father now became directly responsible for plowing, sowing, and harvesting. A teenage girl who had once spun or carried water now bore the weight of running a household, baking bread, tending a garden, and caring for children of her own. The sudden intensification of responsibility made the teenage transition sharp. There was little in between. One year a boy was seen as an extra set of hands. The next he might be a father of his own household. For girls especially, the shift could be abrupt. A girl who had just finished weaving with friends one year might be married, pregnant, and managing her own family the next. Religion and the spiritual marker of adulthood, beyond work and marriage. Religion provided its own thresholds. The church recognized certain ages for religious duties, confession at 7, communion in adolescence, and eligibility for certain vows or roles at later ages. A boy entering a monastery as a novice might do so in his teens, leaving behind the world of family life entirely. A girl entering a convent followed a similar path, with her vows marking her entry into a new form of adulthood, one defined not by marriage or land but by prayer and service. These choices were not always voluntary. Families sometimes placed younger sons in monasteries to avoid dividing land too thinly, or daughters in convents when dowries for marriage were too costly. Yet for the teenagers who took vows, adulthood arrived not through marriage or work, but through religious devotion. The end of childhood play, as adulthood took hold, the world of games and youthful leisure narrowed. Married peasants might still join in village dances, but they did so now as fathers and mothers, not carefree teenagers. Journeymen might gamble or sing, but their minds turned more toward wages and saving for their own shop. Knights might still join in tournaments, but now with the heavy burden of honor and survival. In this sense, the medieval teenager's playfulness was temporary, a brief interlude, before the duties of adulthood consumed nearly every waking hour. What remained constant was the rhythm of feast days and festivals, which still provided breaks even for adults. But the tone shifted. What had been carefree became more restrained, with eyes turned toward children of their own, who now played the games they had once enjoyed. Closing reflections. The medieval teenager did not linger in a world between child and adult. Their lives were short by modern standards, and the community expected them to shoulder responsibility early. A boy of Bagni, 16, might be tilling his own land. A girl of 15 might be married with an infant. A noble squire of 18 might already be a knight in battle. Yet in this swift transition, there was continuity. The labor of childhood prepared for the labor of adulthood. The games of youth trained bodies for work, or spirits for fellowship. The songs and stories of adolescence echoed later in family hearths. As new generations listened to their parents' voices, to us, the medieval teenager's life may appear harsh, their youth too brief. But within that briefness lay moments of joy, belonging, and identity. They were not merely miniature adults, nor were they modern adolescents. They lived a rhythm all their own, one in which